Hi, class. Today we're going to talk about reasons for exploration by the British of the New World. Now, if this were a Latin American history course, then your professor would undoubtedly tell you that the main reason that the Spanish colonized the New World was for God, gold, and glory. What they argue is that the Spanish brought with them priests when they colonized Central and South America, and those priests were bent on converting the heathen savages to Christianity, specifically to Roman Catholicism. They'll also tell you that the chief purpose, once the Spanish discovered that there was gold in Central and South America, the chief purpose of Spanish exploration and colonization was the exploitation of that gold, which they sent back in vast quantities to Spain, God and gold. And the chief exploiters, the chief people who went to the New World to be involved in this colonization and imperialistic scheme, were often younger sons of Spanish aristocrats who weren't going to inherit much of anything from their fathers. The older sons would get most of the goodies, and they were looking for land, they were looking for wealth, they were looking for status. In short, they were looking for glory. God, gold, and glory. So what I want to do today is examine factors that stimulated English colonization and see if, even though a different model was employed, a different system of colonization, a different method of exploitation of the New World, see if that God, gold, and glory model can be employed for English colonization. So let's get on with it. In order to make some sense of the English colonization of North America, we need to look at three developments that took place in England during the 15th and 16th centuries. The first is the English Reformation. The second is the growth of English population and changes in agricultural patterns in Britain. And the third is the growth of nationalism and international competition that took place during the period. So let's start with the English Reformation. By the late 1500s, England was a Protestant nation. The Reformation in England had admittedly not been a very profound theological process, as, say, the Lutheran Reformation on the continent. But in fact, it was a development that took place over the reign of several different monarchs. The initial stimulus for the English Reformation was a royal divorce. In 1533, King Henry VIII was head over heels in lust with a young lady of the court named Anne Boleyn. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Now, the Catholic Church did not recognize divorce, so Henry had to ask the Pope for an annulment. Now, an annulment means that the original marriage never took place at all. There had been some technical problem with the marriage, and so it shouldn't have happened. An annulment then would solve Henry's problem by putting Catherine aside so that he would be free to marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope refused to grant the annulment. Henry was a very strong-willed king, and with the support of Parliament, he left the Roman Catholic Church and founded the Church of England. Now, this was actually a fairly popular move with his subjects because the English Catholic Church wasn't very well respected. Henry's favorite courtiers were invited to acquire church lands at the time the church owned about a third of the land in England, either as gifts from the king or at bargain basement prices. After the break between England and Rome, King Henry VIII, the English monarch, became both the head of the English state and also the head of the English church. Now, at first there wasn't really very much difference between Anglicanism, that is the Church of England, and Catholicism. All the rites and doctrines of the Catholic Church were used during Henry's reign. Henry himself was profoundly Catholic. He just didn't want to be Roman Catholic. So Henry didn't really make any changes in worship during his reign. He only changed who ran the church and separated it from Roman Catholicism, from Rome. When his son came to the throne, Edward VI, Henry died in 1547, Edward VI came to the throne, the Anglican religion became increasingly more Lutheran, that is Protestant, and less Catholic in its ceremony. The church service was in English instead of Latin. A prayer book in the English language was introduced that looked a lot like the Lutheran prayer book. And so England essentially became, during the short reign of Edward VI, a Protestant nation. Now, Edward was a sickly child, and he only had a very short rule from 1547 to 1553, a little less than 6 years. When he died, he was succeeded by his sister, Queen Mary. Now, Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Remember that first wife. Henry ultimately would have 6. The daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and had always remained zealously Roman Catholic. When Mary came to the throne in 1553, she called a parliament and restored Roman Catholicism to England. Now, this wasn't a very popular move. An awful lot of English people were very fond of Protestantism at this stage in the game and really didn't want to be converted back to Roman Catholicism. To make matters more complicated and worse, she married the Catholic King of Spain and attempted to restore Catholicism to England. That's the guy on the left there, Philip II of Spain. He was a zealous Roman Catholic. During Mary's 5-year reign, she treated Protestants with ferocity. She introduced the Inquisition to England, and she began to persecute Protestants. She had several hundred of her own subjects burned at the stake for heresy because they refused to re-embrace the Catholic religion. She's known in history as Bloody Mary Tudor. Now, her reign wasn't very long either. In fact, it was just about 5 years, from 1553 to 1558. When she died, her sister, Elizabeth, came to the throne. Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Now, Elizabeth had spent most of her life looking at English people being persecuted for their faith, first under Henry VIII, then under Edward VI, then intolerably under her sister Mary. Elizabeth was convinced that she needed to reform the Church of England, keep herself as the head of the church, separate England from the Roman Catholic Church. Nevertheless, she believed she needed to create a church that would make most moderate English people, whether they lean toward Protestantism or Catholicism, comfortable. She created what scholars call the Elizabethan Compromise. The Church of England continued to look very much like a Catholic church. Many of its doctrines were similar, but not the same, as Catholicism. And yet, the church appealed to Protestants as well. Both moderate Protestants and moderate Catholics could attend Elizabeth's church without being uncomfortable and without feeling that they had no place in the Church of England. So long as they were willing to give their loyalty to England and give their loyalty to the Queen as the head of the church and state, then most English people were comfortable with the church. But the 16th century wasn't really a very good time for moderatism. One of Elizabeth's problems was that many Protestants had left England during the reign of Queen Mary and escaped to the continent and settled in parts of Europe where they were exposed to and embraced the teaching of a Swiss religious reformer named John Calvin. Calvin had introduced a new kind of Protestantism to the European continent, one that was more radical in many ways than Lutherans' Protestantism. Among the things that the Calvinists despised the most was Roman Catholic worship and Roman Catholics in general. Many of these English Calvinists who returned to England during Elizabeth I's reign felt that the English Reformation simply had not gone far enough. They wanted to abolish the Anglican Church hierarchy, the bishops and the archbishops. Some of them also wanted to free the church from political influences. Some of them believed that Anglican worship was much too similar to Catholic worship. They wanted the English church to look more like European Calvinist churches. Since the English Calvinists wanted to purify the Anglican Church of Catholic trappings, they gained the insulting term Puritans. Now, Elizabeth would have considerable trouble with some Puritans, but by and large, the Puritans still respected her for at least moving the English church in the right direction, that is, toward Protestantism. Her successors would have considerably greater difficulties with the Puritans. I should probably also mention at this point that Elizabeth also had trouble with radical Catholics. During Elizabeth's reign, Pope Pius V announced that, in effect, it was not only acceptable, but even really cool to assassinate a Protestant ruler, especially if their successor would be Roman Catholic and would return that state to the Roman Catholic fold. During her reign, a number of Catholics attempted to assassinate Queen Elizabeth, and not only did the English then equate Catholicism with unacceptable religion, but they also began to equate Catholicism with treason. Elizabeth died in 1603. She had never married, had no children, and therefore had left no heirs. So the throne of England moved to her successors, the Stuart family, who were the kings of Scotland. The first of the Stuarts was James I, the guy on the left there, and James disliked or I should say, disliked Puritans as a result of his treatment by Puritans or Protestants in Scotland. His son Charles I, that's really just one guy there on the right. His son Charles I had no use for Puritans either. Now, neither one of them had very much respect for Parliament, and that was unfortunate too because A, Parliament had grown increasingly powerful over the previous century, and B, over the reign of James I, it had become increasingly, at least in the House of Commons, more Puritan. The Stuarts insisted that royal power was derived directly from God. In other words, they were absolutist monarchs, at least to a great extent. Since the head of the state in England also happened to be the head of the church, any challenge to the one was automatically a challenge to the other. So there was no distinction between heresy, that is, not following the rules of the Anglican Church, and treason. If a heretic, say a Puritan, criticized the king for religious reasons, then he automatically became a traitor to the state as well. Increasingly, Puritans became both a religious and a political liability for the crown. In the 1620s and 30s, as we will see, both the Stuart kings and the English Puritans saw lots of reasons for Puritans to go elsewhere. For instance, to migrate to America, where they could practice their religion unhindered by the Anglican Church and the government at home. And the Stuarts really sort of looked forward to getting rid of them. So in the early part of the second decade of the 1600s, Puritans began to slowly, in small groups, leave England to go elsewhere, to escape from perceived persecution by the Stuarts. Some went, as we're going to see, to Holland, where they weren't very comfortable either. Others would go to South America and to the Caribbean, and then some would go to colonize in North America. Now, the next thing I want to talk about for a little while is social and economic dynamics from around 1500 to around 1620, 1630. What we'll be talking about essentially to some extent is demographics and population. An enormous population growth took place in Britain between about 1530 and 1600. During this period, the English population more than doubled. This increase in population in such a short period of time led to a lot of social and economic problems, as an increasing number of people competed for the necessities of food, clothing, shelter. Inflation in England grew. At the same time, the increase in the number of workers caused real wages to plummet. Many great landholders decided to increase their profits by taking land once used in grain production and turning that land into sheep production. Up until the middle of the 1500s, the vast majority of the gentry, the land-owning commoners, of England, who had, as Monty Python would say, huge tracts of land, had grown corn. Now, when we talk about corn, we usually are referring to maize. In England, the term corn went for any kind of grain, from wheat to barley to oats. So the great landowners in England raised grain in order to sell to make their profits. But by the middle of the 1500s, grain production, even though the price of grain had risen somewhat, grain production wasn't profitable enough for the great gentry families to continue the lifestyle that they liked. Now, most gentry farms were operated by tenant farmers, English peasants who lived on the land of the great gentleman farmers, and who paid their rent for their cottages in produce that they produced on the grounds of the farm. Now, this is kind of like the feudal system in Europe, but a little bit different, because tenant farmers had no real claim to the property on which they lived, the way that, say, French serfs did. So, as the great landholders, the great gentry, realized that they needed to make more profit, they decided to turn to sheep production for wool and meat rather than grain production. And of course, if they're raising sheep, they don't need a whole lot of tenant farmers to plant the grain and reap the harvest. They only need a few shepherds. What they need is land. So many of the great landholders in the early part and latter part of the 1500s began converting their farms over to raising sheep. And in doing so, they dismissed their tenants. They tore down their cottages, and all of a sudden England had a real problem of unemployed agriculturalists, if you will, unemployed tenant farmers, kicked off their land looking for work and shelter. Now, sheep production was very profitable for the English gentry. Wool was one of the most important exports that England had, and the amount of wool that became available during the 16th century grew tremendously while prices remained relatively stable. But it was also extremely difficult for English society and caused tremendous social and economic disruption. Many of these itinerant farmers who needed shelter and income, as is always the case, moved to the cities. Unfortunately, there wasn't really much work yet to be had in these towns and cities. So England began to experience what we today would call a homeless problem. As the problem increased, officials, city and town officials, and even government officials became obsessed with the problem of maintaining order in towns and cities across England, especially in London. The homeless problem was sort of overwhelming. The streets were filled with people who turned to crime, prostitution, theft, for income because there was no other work available. And cities and towns became chaotic. And officials never really like chaos. They much prefer order. Some officials began to argue that perhaps the best thing that could be done for these homeless, landless, troublesome populations would be to send them elsewhere, where they could find land and work, where they could become productive once again, and most important, where they could get out of the officials' hair in the cities and countryside. American colonization, some people began to say, would be ideal, not only for these displaced farmers, but also for England. To send them to the Americas would give the English poor a second chance in a land-rich, labor-poor new world. Now, we talked about religion and demographics. The third stimulus to English colonization was nationalism. England viewed itself with some justice as a small island state surrounded by enemies, powerful enemies. Catholic Spain was the greatest threat, but France and Holland, also called the Netherlands, also threatened England. Mary Tudor, if you remember, had married Philip II of Spain, who was both a powerful European monarch and a Catholic zealot. After Mary's death, Philip claimed a right to rule England. Philip and other Catholic rulers were also eager to spread Catholicism to those areas of Europe that had strayed from the Catholic path by embracing Protestantism. France also posed a threat to England. France and England were sort of traditional enemies. And the Dutch had become a military and commercial power in the previous 50 or 60 years, and also posed a threat to the British under increasing circumstances. Now, unlike modern economists, Europeans in the 1500s and 1600s believed that there was only so much wealth in the world to go around. Wealth was power. So if you lost the race to acquire wealth, and of course one of those types of wealth was colonies, and your enemies gained that wealth, then you would be weaker in terms of geostrategy, and they would be stronger. This idea, this economic idea, was called mercantilism, by the way. Colonization became a way that your country could both become wealthier and also a way to keep your enemies from gaining a greater position of strength in the ongoing power politics of Europe. And so, once again, in terms of nationalism, some English leaders began to look favorably at the possibility of colonization in order to enhance England's wealth and in order to keep other enemy countries like Spain and France and Holland from gaining territory in the New World and gaining wealth themselves. In 1584, Richard Hakluyt, a geography professor at Oxford, wrote a book entitled A Discourse on the Western Planting. Now, Hakluyt wasn't talking about planting crops like tobacco or cabbage. He was talking about planting people, for preference English people, in colonies in North America. He combined all of the arguments, all of the stuff that we've talked about so far, into one big coherent argument. And he dedicated the book to Queen Elizabeth. He hoped that Queen Elizabeth would read the book and would buy it, would share his idea of colonizing America. First, Hakluyt argued there's gold in America, lots and lots of gold. We know there is because the Spanish have been bringing it back to Spain by the boatload in convoys. But even if there is no gold, even if we find no gold, planting English colonies will relieve the population problems in England and turn useless, unemployed, poor Englishmen into useful and productive farmers. And England will benefit both because they won't be the responsibility of local government anymore, and because their surplus produce will be sellable English goods. So even if there is no gold, and of course there is, England profits. Englishmen, Hakluyt wrote, also have an obligation to both spread the true religion, Anglicanism of course, to the natives in the New World, and to keep the dreadful French and Spanish Roman Catholics from doing the same. Oh, did I mention that the English don't like Catholics? By spreading the Anglican religion, English missionaries and settlers would live in peace and trade with the natives, and from this trade, England would prosper. England would acquire wealth. So even if there's no gold, and of course there is, then England would come out the winner. Finally, England would attain the glory of planting new English colonies in the New World that would constrain and limit the colonization plans of her enemies. So even if there's no gold, England would profit because her European rivals would not. Hakluyt and others also argued that North America was essentially a paradise, where food literally dropped into your lap, ripe and sweet and ready to eat, where deer and rabbits jumped onto the table and butchered themselves and threw themselves into the roasting fire. America was a place where there was so much game that meat climbed into the dinner table and committed suicide before your very eyes. In America, everything that was planted grew bigger and better than it ever had in Europe. The New World smelled of perfume and had all that anyone would ever need to become healthy, wealthy, and self-sufficient. England, like Spain and France, can be said, I believe, to have had very similar motives for colonization then, that is, God, gold, and glory.